Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Richard Wendorf, the Stanford Calderwood Director and Librarian of the Boston Athenaeum, and it gives me a great pleasure to welcome you here on yet another rainy day. Our speaker this afternoon just happens to be the editor-in-chief of House and Garden magazine, as if you haven't noticed, and we thank her for this gift to all of us this afternoon. When I had the privilege of introducing Dominique Browning almost exactly a year ago, I started with a confession, which is that I subscribe to more shelter magazines than the Boston Athenaeum does. And so I was so delighted to be able to introduce someone who has created an absolutely wonderful magazine here in America. She writes wonderfully, she edits very well indeed, and it's just a delight to see it arrive in the mail each month. She was talking last year about her recently published book, which was called Around the House and In the Garden. And in the selections she made during her conversation and reading, she was mostly around the house rather than in the garden. But she promised us that she was working on a number of essays about the garden, about her garden in particular, and indeed, if you've been following the magazine, that's exactly what she has done. Those essays are now gathered into her new book entitled Paths of Desire, The Passions of a Suburban Gardner. She's going to sign copies of her book after her reading, and I look forward to hearing about the garden this time. Please join me in welcoming Dominique Browning.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. I must warn you, this is probably the most crackpot gardening book you're going to get your hands on this season. So I don't know about a collection of essays. As the editor of House and Garden, of course, I see hundreds of gardens, and we publish quite a few of them in the course of publishing the magazine. And they're very beautiful and grand and ambitious and highly accomplished. And that's as it should be. Is that okay? Can you hear now? No. Oops. I think it has to be right there. Is that okay? All right. Anyway, we publish really quite wonderful gardens, and I feel that's what we should be doing in a magazine that wants to teach people about design and great principles of design. However, as a writer, I really wanted to approach gardens in a different way. One thing you'll notice in this book is that there isn't a photograph in it. And that's because I'm not writing about a garden that is so photogenic. What I really wanted to write about was the way a garden feels. I wanted to explore another side of gardening. I wanted to talk about what goes into making a garden. Everything from hosta to skunks and neighbors and teenagers and friends and all the emotional side of gardening that is so important, all the memories and the nostalgia that has to do with how we shape our gardens. My garden in Westchester is just about 1/4 of an acre, and it's right off a main street in town. My neighbors are very close, and the book actually reads like a novel, although it's all true, but it has a beginning, and that is what happens when my neighbor up the hill re-landscapes and causes flooding into my yard, which makes a wall fall down, and this wall falling down makes me attack my garden again, since everything was destroyed after that flood. So that's the beginning, and there are characters who weave their way through this book: the helpful men, the useless boys, the true love, the tree man, and of course the hermit. That's sort of me in this book. It even has a kind of a happy ending, or at least a wistful ending. Lots of books give you tips, techniques, and sources, and I wanted to write a book that captures a sense of place, what it feels like in a garden. We always say that you can learn a lot about people by the way they furnish their rooms. You can get the same sense from their gardens. How extensive are the beds? You're getting, see, that's what's bothering you, right? Yeah. How extensive are the beds? How free is the sense of color? How bold are the plantings? How warm or cool does the garden feel? You learn a lot from people by the way they garden. We each wander a different path as we make our gardens. And if you slow down and pay attention to what you're doing, which you have to, pay attention to the little things when you're gardening, you learn a lot about your own path as you do your garden. And that's what Paths of Desire is about. What I thought I'd do here is read from the book, as I was asked to, and I'll talk a little bit about what's going on in the book, and also I'll be happy to answer questions about book or magazine, decorating, or gardening. Is the sound okay now? Is that better? Yeah, it sounds better to me too. Okay. This is not a reading that's going to be full of plant materials, as they call them, and full of tips and techniques for gardening, so I can answer those questions to the best of my abilities later, but really what I'm thinking about is, for the starters, animals. The suburban animal plague. We have it in Westchester. Deer here and deer all over, actually, the Northeast are changing the way we garden, changing the plant materials we use. My particular peeve is skunks, who have literally chased me off my driveway and, while it's still light out, greeted me at the door when I wake. Possums. Just the other day, I went into my garage and reached into a garden bin that I hadn't opened through the winter and stuck my hand right onto the back of a big, fat possum. You can imagine I nearly had a heart attack. You listen to them screaming at night, fighting, yowling, shrieking. It's really a mania of activity out there. And, the fact is it's all gotten too close. And it's not just an aesthetic thing, plants disappearing, the beds that you make that are rooted up and torn away by raccoons and possums, but we get notices just about every year to watch out for the rabid animals. Of course, I can't tell what's rabid anymore. They all seem crazy to me. So. Anyway, I'll read you about the varmints. My garden is plagued by skunks and raccoons, possums, rabbits, squirrels, gophers, moles, and mice. I expect to see deer get off at the station any day now. Worse yet, I had the suburban version of all these animals, fatter, meaner, smellier, messier, lazier, and more aggressive than their country counterparts. Right at home in our yards, in our garages, in our driveways, in our garbage cans. Theirs is not a peaceable kingdom. They fight with each other and with every poor cat or dog or toddler that gets in their way. They fight over the territory, they fight over the grubs, they fight over the birds' eggs, they fight over the chicken bones and the pizza rinds. They even fight over scraps of tissue and tin foil. It is not a nice way to begin the day, in your nightgown, in the driveway, writing and refilling a stinking garbage can that's been knocked to the ground, its contents shredded into impossibly small bits, strewn across the yard, blowing and rolling into the street. There is no such thing as a locking garbage can top. Raccoons are much smarter than children who are flummoxed by garbage cans, unable to figure out how to remove the top when they're asked to take out the trash. Raccoons know exactly what to do, no matter what top you give them. Raccoons cannot wait to take out the trash. We are in close quarters in suburbia with the animals, too close. The wildlife in the garden seemed to bring out the predatory streak of the suburbanite. Talk at cocktail parties or cookouts frequently turned to the animal problem, and it revealed a side of my neighbors that haunted me a bit. It was at a block party that I learned that one couple frequently trapped skunks in a contraption they bought from a hardware store, put them in a plastic bag, and attached the bag to the exhaust pipe of their car. These are my neighbors. Another confessed, bragged that he had arrived at another method of killing animals after realizing that trying to suffocate them only made them hibernate. Another borrowed a paint gun from his brother, not too far removed from my Annie Oakley fantasies with a BB gun. One afternoon, as I was weeding, a possum waddled past in a hurry. Right behind him were 3 little boys, no more than 7 years old, wielding large baseball bats. I was horrified at their bloodlust, but took some comfort in the way the boys hung back, looking more fearful than their prey that they would succeed. The animal problem in suburbia was not bringing out the best in anyone. It was past time to call the exterminators. And that was when I learned that they no longer exterminate. They control. They are professionals who practice pest control, which, when I finally found the listings in the phone book, sounded dubious, more like traffic controllers who suggest alternate flight plans. Pest control involves setting up traps so obvious that even the stupid skunks would not climb in. Why would they, when they can walk around to the backside and nibble the marshmallows through the wires of the cage? Yes, marshmallows. It turned out that the suggested bait for luring skunks away from grubs was marshmallows and cat food. The pro finally arrived from New Jersey in a large van that looked promisingly like the sort of thing a homicidal lunatic would live in, crammed with pillows, wire hangers, sharp tools, and rubber gloves and traps, plastic sheets and filthy torn overalls, and half-eaten peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, and bags of potato chips for the drivers. He set up 3 traps, 2 the size of a shoebox, and because I insisted that no suburban skunk would fit into those little things, 1 larger one. He pushed a can of cat food to the back of the small traps and baited the large trap with marshmallows, which did look delicious, bright white squares gleaming brilliantly in the twilight. I crossed the lawn to warn the neighbors not to let their children be tempted. Did I say that I had to pay $180 cash up front for this service? I went to bed that night feeling hopeful. I woke at dawn the next morning like a child, frantic to see what Santa had left behind. The traps were empty, of animals and of bait. I called pest control headquarters to complain. An elderly woman with a tough tone in her thin voice answered. "Animals must have reached in and got the bait," she said. "But they aren't supposed to reach in. They're supposed to get trapped inside. I am not running a restaurant here. I am not trying to feed everybody. I am trying to get rid of them." I was becoming hysterical. "Listen, lady, you said you got skunks. Skunks don't reach in. Raccoons reach in. They're big. Probably a raccoon reached in. They stretch their arms to the back of the trap and they get the food. You told us skunks. So you got raccoons or you got skunks?" "I have everything," I said, "and I want traps that catch everything. I don't want useless little traps that feed everything. By the way, what do you do with the animals if you ever catch them?" "We catch them, miss. We have a 95% success rate. We release them into the wild. You said skunks, not raccoons." Of course, I was powerless, having already paid for this service. She agreed to send someone out to refill the cages. The next night, I went to bed feeling like a Canadian settler, wondering anxiously if I would lure anything into my traps. I pondered the release factor, wondering if the wilds could mean a short waddle from my house into the wooded highway embankment, or the back of my neighbor's garage. The next morning, I made the rounds. The small trap, once again, had been emptied of food. What a disgrace. But there in the large trap, filling it entirely, was a raccoon who had finished her satisfying main course from the small trap and wandered over to the large one to see about that marshmallow dessert. The raccoon was making whirring, trilling noises, sounding rather like a dove, but at least 2 octaves lower. It was so plaintive I wanted to release it, but I didn't dare. One of the boys came into the garden to look at the trap. "How would you like it, Mom, if I were caught and moved to another part of the country and you didn't know where I had gone? Kidnapped. You wouldn't like it one bit, would you?" How could I tell him that the animals didn't feel that way about families? What do I know? It certainly sounded like this raccoon was upset. She interrupted her keening only to put her face into the tin of food and lick every last moist crumb from the corners. Several birds were in the trees overhead, screeching at the raccoon. I don't think it was in sympathy for her plight, as I'm sure enough of their hatchlings had disappeared down that fat thing's throat. I asked Theo how he felt about baby birds. The raccoon was now resting on her back, her paws holding the ceiling of the cage. She looked comfy. I called headquarters. "So, raccoons, I told you, miss. I need bigger traps. If the raccoons are eating the skunks' dinner before the skunks get to it, I will never catch the skunks. I need skunk traps that the raccoons cannot raid." You caught the raccoon. You have skunk traps. It was Kafkaesque. I gave up. Several more nights went by with the bait emptying from the traps. I stopped calling the professionals. I sent my son to the supermarket for more marshmallows and cat food and reset the traps myself. We caught another raccoon. We caught 2 possums. True to form, they rolled over and played dead as soon as I came near the trap. The pros took them away. The skunks remain at large. The animals, that's one thing you really have to deal with gardening these days. Another is the driveway. Most of us don't think of driveways as part of our gardens, and we should, of course. It's the way you come up, it's the way you leave, and it leads to your house, which is the biggest thing in the garden, actually, and should be very well considered when you're designing a garden. I actually spend a lot of time thinking about my driveway. Well, let me just read you about the driveway. The only person who had ever been gracious about my old driveway was the true love. He used to call me from his car on the way over to my house to tell me he was about a half hour away, and this I knew meant that he was at the bottom of the driveway, preparing for the last leg of the journey, all 20 yards of it. A rough and perilous journey it was, made worse after the fall of the wall, when the gushing river that spilled off the neighbor's yard came down my already crumbling drive. This happened every time it rained, and we had had a wet spring. The resulting erosion had a certain domestic magnificence. There's always that tantalizing challenge buried just beneath the surface of your lassitude, that tempting question, how bad can it get? The driveway had become a series of long trenches, and you had to navigate your car very carefully at the top of the straights in order not to drag the bottom, or worse, become beached. There was a trick to it, but involved getting the wheels up onto the edge of the woods, and eventually that edge, too, crumbled and made a new furrow. But the drive had been in bad shape for years. I was accustomed to it and patient with its decline. When the true love signaled his arrival, I would venture to the end of the driveway and jump into the car with him, driver's side, of course, and he, being a thoroughly modern man, would have buckets full of lilacs so the car would be wreathed in perfume. Somehow, what with greetings and kisses and creepings and much exclaiming over new tufts of moss and new scrapes on the sassafras, new views through the trees and new plastic monuments in the neighbor's yard, new veins and new craters and new ways of wrapping arms around a person and a steering wheel at the same time, the trip easily lasted 20 minutes, or so it seemed. And then, of course, there was the time spent at the top of the drive when the true love would turn the volume up on red Cadillac and a black mustache, throw open the car doors, and sweep me into his arms for a jitterbug. Well, the true love understood the magnificence of domestic erosion. Everyone else complained about the driveway. The boys, in their feverish campaign for driveway reform, reported fresh complaints every time their father dropped them off. You don't feel it, Mom. Your car is higher. Dad scrapes the bottom of his car every time he comes up the driveway, Theo said. Your father never was a good driver, boys, I said cheerfully. Did I ever tell you about the time in Texas when he was arrested for driving the wrong way down a one-way street? Or the time a homeless person was living in his car during the day while he had it parked in the garage? Your father never even noticed the car was already such a mess. Their father began dropping the boys off curbside. My mother, when she came to visit, simply drove up the lawn and parked in a patch of grass. Okay, so sometimes she crushed a few peonies. It was my fault. I held firm in my refusal to change it. I liked it. Then, late one night, as I was getting out of my car in a ball gown and high heels, I miscalculated my footing, tripped into a ditch, and twisted my ankle. It was too humiliating to tell anyone how I had hurt myself, so I didn't. One by one, over the next few months, the boys came home, arms and legs scraped, bleeding and bruised from having tripped into a trench or two. Time for a new driveway. So I called my helpful men, who got to work, ripped everything up, and then disappeared. The months wheeled around, months and months of me picking up the telephone, trying to find out when they were coming back. They wheeled around to the time of my son's graduation from high school. I had organized a luncheon for friends and family after the ceremony. A few days before the party, I came home from work to find, parked in what that morning had been the driveway, a bulldozer, a deep pit, many huge boulders, and no men again. The whole thing was cordoned off with a yellow banner marked "Danger, Danger, Danger." Gary reappeared, the helpful man, the day before the graduation party to tell me that the concrete mixer was arriving soon, and while the end of the drive and the new sidewalks were being poured, no one was to cross the threshold. Fine, I said, I'm glad you're starting, but high school graduation is tomorrow. I'm throwing a big party, and that's the only day you can't pour cement. People have to be able to get to the party. My parents are coming. They can't climb over rocks, okay? Don't worry. Concrete trucks wouldn't come on Saturday. No one does anything on Saturday. Everything will be fine. Is this the only way to the house? Said Gary, eyeing the woods dubiously. No front path? There is a front path, that old brick walk that starts halfway up the drive. That? We got to rip that up. Drainage has to go under there. After much haggling, Gary and I finally agreed on an alternate course for mighty waters and drainage down the other side of the driveway. The night before Alex's graduation, I woke up at 4 a.m, began crying at 4:05, my baby, don't leave me, and did not stop until 9:45, 15 minutes before the ceremony began. I was in no condition then to run into the cement mixer at the bottom of the driveway. All the helpful men were there, of course, along with some I had never seen before, all working on a Saturday for the first time in the history of helpful men. They are like moths to a flame when it comes to heavy equipment. The blasted-out sidewalk had been squared off. Cement was gushing into the molds. I didn't even stop. I clambered through the trees, scrambled down some rocks, and ran to the high school. Luckily, I was out of tears. 3 hours later, when 16 of us came back to the house for lunch, the helpful men were gone. The wet cement, raked as meticulously as a Japanese Zen garden, was cordoned off. Gary had built a steep ramp up the front and a lovely little path of plywood, zigzagging through the trees to the dry part of the drive. The boys exchanged significant glances. While we were at lunch, every child at the party snuck down the drive to carve his or her initials into the sidewalk. The youngest ones, who had more trouble with spelling, had to try 2 or 3 times to get it right. We all know that wet cement is to children what heavy equipment is to helpful men. Gary was outraged the next day. There don't seem to be so many kids in this neighborhood, he said, eyeing the trees suspiciously as if the children might have sprung from them. Look at those scribbles. The wall builder was beside himself. That cement was perfect, just perfect. Peering down at everyone's handiwork, I claimed ignorance of the culprits, though their identities were staring us in the face. Well, it's your driveway, said Gary. I suppose everyone got some sort of revenge on everyone else, and I got a lovely souvenir of graduation day. And then finally, the new driveway was done. A thing of beauty. Too beautiful. I was in shock. It looked new. It looked different. It looked smooth. It looked swanky. It looked so fancy you could throw a cocktail party on it. The worst of it was, it looked inviting. The garden was meant to be entered by slow degree, and the old driveway had set the pace. I would have to invent other distractions along the way. The new driveway was going to cause fresh trouble, I could tell. The FedEx man was complimentary. The UPS man whistled. The postman said he might even start using the driveway instead of cutting through the trees. Everyone came to see the new driveway, my sisters, my parents, my girlfriends. The graduate was thrilled. He is the sort of child who appreciates order. My youngest, who appreciates disorder, came home from camp. His father, effusively complimenting Theo on his new driveway, deposited him and his large, heavy trunk right in the middle of it. Theo rang the bell, and by the time I got to the door, he was unpacking the trunk, spreading his clothes and crafts out on the driveway as if it were the floor of his room. He set up a little display of his prizes. He scattered his filthy clothes around to get some fresh air. He retrieved his folded camping chair from the bottom of the trunk, opened it up, sat in it, and began to rock. He had the right idea. I leaned against the stairs to the side door. We settled in for a nice long visit on the driveway. It could have been a new patio. Theo recounted the horrors of summer camp. My father called to check up on the progress, and I began to whine. The new driveway, it looks new, it looks different, it looks fancy, it isn't the same, and on and on. My father listened patiently, somewhat used to me by now. It looks like the runway of a small airport, I said. All that's missing is a sign that says, "Land here, come visit, welcome." Well, darling, he said sensibly, maybe that's not such a bad message. Well, toward the end of the renovation of the garden, which was a process that took about a month and which a year, and I wish a month, and which I describe in the book. Toward the end, I decided to throw a dinner party for 60 people. I am not a confident hostess under the best of circumstances, and I think I did this just to give myself and all my other helpful men a deadline. A friend of mine was getting married, and we would have a garden party for her. Since my house couldn't fit 60 people, and there was no room for tents, I was prepared to have the whole thing outside. And I wasn't worried about it at all. We were in a massive drought, a record-setting drought, no rain for months and months and months, and it was sort of a miracle that the garden was actually getting in because things were parched. The day of the party arrived. On the afternoon of the party, the sky was mysteriously clouding up. Well, perhaps that would cut the heat. My friends and I rolled several small round tables into the garden and set them up on what remained of the grass. We unwrapped dozens of fat candles and unpacked dozens of hurricane lamps, bought in deeply discounted bulk, we love Crate and Barrel, a bargain too good to pass up. You can never have too many hurricane lamps to protect the candles in the garden, and candles are the best way to light a garden at night. The caterer arrived with a dozen men and women to help serve. Having decided that my kitchen was much too small to prepare food for 60, we had agreed that she would bring only food that needed warming. The chef marched her troops into the kitchen, began unpacking dozens of mysterious boxes, and put 3 men sitting on the sofa to work shelling peas. Within half an hour, a truck rolled up the driveway and proceeded to dump in front of the garage a barbecue grill the size of a ping-pong table. 7 bags of charcoal and boxes of match later, the chef had a fire roaring. Then came the rains. I had not seen such a torrential downpour since the day a year earlier that the wall had fallen down. Cooks, waiters, friends, and family all stood at the kitchen window watching in despair that turned to horror as it began to hail, and large ice cubes began to bounce off the table and collect in the potted plants. I went up to my bedroom, and there my friend Laura found me an hour later. "What are you doing?" she said. "I am staring stupidly out the window," I replied, sitting cross-legged on my bed. "There's nothing I can do. We're finished." "No, this is a great development," she said. "It's only 5 in the afternoon. The party starts at 7. This way, the rain will be over by dinner." I looked at her, stunned. Where does such cheer come from? The rain began to let up after half an hour, and we came back to life a bit, riffling stacks of napkins, putting candles into the glass columns, and then the skies yellowed and darkened and opened up and poured down their wrath again. This happened 3 times, and each time I grew gloomier and Laura grew brighter. As the 3rd storm eased into a gentle drizzle and we began to sweep ankle-deep puddles off the porches and terraces, Laura asked me about lighting the candles. What was I waiting for? I must have looked at her as if she had lost her mind, but she said, "In India, they light the candles in the rain all the time." India. Why not? We seem to have developed a monsoon season. We took umbrellas out into the drizzle and started placing the glass lamps and their golden beeswax pillars along the curves of the beds, under the trees, by the sides of paths, on rocks and on tables. I began to light the candles. The sky was ominously darkening again, and this time it turned out to be evening coming on. One by one, the damp candles spluttered and flickered, and then the wicks dried and caught and flared up tall. And gradually, as the drizzle let up, the garden began to glow in the soft light. The foliage was heavy with water, branches hanging in graceful arcs, gently, sweetly dripping, the green of the leaves as profound a color as I have ever seen. As the temperature dropped into the balmy 80s, a mist began to rise up off the ground and hang in the air. The plants seemed to have thickened in the soaking. Tiny, lacy spiders' hammocks, beaded with rain, glistened in the grass. The garden had never been so enchanting. The fireflies came out and began to blink and twinkle through the trees. Fireflies must have been the inspiration for Tinkerbell with her lamp that turned on and off. Laura and I moved the porch sofa to the edge of the lawn and set the coffee table in front of it to clear space on the porch for a bar. We lit a few more lamps and then sat quietly for a few minutes, breathing in the magic of the garden. "See," said Laura, "you should always light the candles." 60 people arrived. Some kicked off their fancy heels and gamely tiptoed through puddles. Only one person slipped and sprained a wrist. His name was Romeo, and he was serving whiskey sours. It seemed like one casualty was pretty good for a garden party, which for some reason I had always imagined to be intensely fraught, raucous affairs. The waiters were so efficient at whisking away glasses as soon as they were put down that guests were constantly returning to the bar. Soon, everyone had lost track of how much they had drunk. The cook presented one of the most delicious meals I'd ever eaten, grilled on the vast contraption that was now blazing merrily under the only tent we had managed to set up. To my surprise, my older son showed up for the dinner. I had invited him, but Alex had shrugged me off, casually saying nothing, the way teenagers do when they want to leave open their options. He was wearing a white shirt and shorts, and he looked handsome and poised. I watched him arrive from across the garden. He found my sister and several of the friends he had known through his childhood and took a seat at the table with them. Their conversation looked animated. I could not bring myself to go over and greet him. I wanted to prolong my observation of him as a young man at a dinner party, not as his mother's distant, judging teenage son about to leave for college. He was enjoying himself, and that gave me great pleasure. As dessert was being served, I went over to my son's table. He was in an expansive mood. Our friends at the table were leaning in to listen to him. I came up from behind and heard them in conversation about the garden. I hung back quietly. None of them had seen the new garden, the new arrangement of trees, all the new plantings, the new paths, before that evening. And for all I could tell, my son hadn't seen a thing either. I was mistaken. "The whole thing has changed," I overheard Alex saying. "Everything is different. Mom keeps making the beds bigger and bigger." He pointed to a spot in the back corner that had 3 evergreens planted in it. Everyone turned. "Look, that's where my swing set used to be. Gone, covered up by trees." Then he pointed to where his sandbox had been, a small wooden structure built and painted one afternoon by my father. The sandbox, and I might add, a great place for the possums, raccoons, and skunks. The sandbox is now covered with bushes, Alex explained. The older we get, the more stuff disappears. The garden gets deeper and deeper. She's covering up our childhood. I was stunned by my son. He didn't sound angry at all. He sounded wistful and a little perplexed. He sounded like me. For all his galumphing about leaving home and heading off to college that fall, in 6 months, in 4 months, in 3 weeks, he was crowing with glee over the rapid and inexorable march through time. He seemed reluctant to be leaving behind his swing set and his sandbox. I wondered if he understood that the sight of them was too painful for me. The time of my son's childhoods had gone by quickly enough for me to be surprised that they were already grown up, but slowly enough for their abandoned toys to rot and collapse. "Doesn't the garden look beautiful?" Alex said to our guests. "Teenagers can break your heart. Only by accident will you find out what they know, and it turns you inside out. I wanted to tell him that I was making the new beds for him and for his brother to return to, and for me to enjoy when they had left me behind at home. That the deepening and the widening, the planting and the pruning, the digging up and the covering up, the gardening would never stop, could never stop so long as I was there. And that I was only tucking into each bed for safekeeping my memories of all the time together we had been blessed with in that garden. But I didn't say a word. Lily, you're obviously pregnant. I'm happy to answer any questions anybody has. Do I still have skunks? Yes, I have a lot of skunks, and they're coming to life as spring comes to life. And I'm going to send a new round of trappers out, but they're never going to go away. And I'm trying all this stuff to get rid of the grubs, and it lasts for about 2 weeks, and then they're back again, sticking their little noses into holes and making things smell horrible. And attacking cats. I've noticed that the skunks and the cats are at war in the neighborhood. So, yes?
How would you describe editing a magazine versus writing your novels for you?
Editing versus writing. Obviously two completely different things, but very complementary. I feel that when I'm editing the magazine, it's really turning outward in the world, and I do it with a group of very talented and involved and engaged people. So it's a real team effort, and I'm using other people's work to get a point across. As journalists in this field, we're always looking for the best architecture, the best, interior design. We're always out there sort of hunting and gathering and bringing it back into our pages. So we use a great architect's house to tell something about a house or about building. When I'm writing, I'm turning inward, and I'm really narrowing my focus into my own life, because that's how I write, and using that to come out and reach people. And it's obviously a very quiet and individual engagement. I do it by myself, and there can be noise around me, but I'm not working in a team, and I don't write collaboratively. So it's almost as if it uses such a different part of myself that I can't now think of one without the other. Yes? You mean, well, it's not a novel, although it sounds unbelievable. I really do have neighbors like this and problems like this. But no, I can't write during the week. I write on weekends, or I write on holiday, and I look for chunks of time. I can't write during the day when I'm sort of involved at the office, because I can't let it go enough to sort of turn inward. But I grab time when I can, and if it's really crazy at the office for a while, I have to put things away. And now that I've gotten to the age where I can't remember anything anymore, if I put something aside for 2 months, I have to spend all this time rereading what I did. So it's getting hard. Okay.
Have you started to think about what your next book is going to be about?
No, not yet. No. Yes?
You read so well, and it's like you give such a good reading, and it's so funny. You think about doing a book on tape version?
A book on tape. Oh, sure. If anybody wants me to, I'd be happy to. But thank you very much for the compliment. Thank you all for coming.